Searching. Now disconnected from AV Samsung Soundbar R6 series.
So in this video, I'm going to be going over how I built the Home Assistant automation that allows me to control both the music and the lights during my D&D sessions. And hopefully so you'll be able to recreate it yourself. This is the first big project that I've sort of taken on in Home Assistant, so I am sure there are ways that I did things more complex or maybe inefficiently, but this hopefully will give you an idea and maybe you can iterate off of it. I'm going to be posting this both to areas where people are familiar with Home Assistant and to areas where people are not familiar with Home Assistant. So if you want to just jump to the automations and the variables and all of the technical stuff, you can jump to the time code that should be showing up right now. But we're going to start at the very basics. So what do you need? Obviously, you're going to need Home Assistant, and you're going to need to get it installed. There's some very good documentation on their website. In addition to just the basic Home Assistant, you're going to need some other devices. You're going to need some sort of lighting control. I have Philips Hue because that's what I bought way back when. And so I have that integrated into my Home Assistant. For me, it just picked it up right away. If you're using a different system, the integration might be different and some of the coding may be different as well. You also need an integration called HACS, or Home Assistant Community Store. I'll link down to a guide that I found for installing it that was pretty easy. And then from HACS, you'll need two things. One, you'll need the Alexa Media Player. And that is what allows us to cue all the Alexa commands and also play the music. And then the other thing for the interface is you'll need the custom button card from the front end section of HACS. So I use some helpers to help drive this automation, 3 of them in fact. The first is a drop down, and I have it named D&D Dark Bright. This basically tells me if it's a dark scene or a bright scene, basically day or night in the scene. And it has 3 settings on it: dark, bright, and off. I have a D&D mode, and this is a Boolean, so on off, and this is basically acts like a master switch for all of my D&D automations. None of them should run if D&D mode is switched off. Also, when it switches on and off, it kicks in some automations that sort of set things up for the other automations. And then finally, I have a drop-down called D&D Scene, and this contains all the different scenes that I use, and also an off setting. So next is the interface that I've built. I have this on its own page. It consists of a media player for the Echo that I use to play the media where I play D&D. This just allows me to, if I want to skip a track, play, pause, I can do it all right from this one place. I then have a button built specifically for that D&D master switch, and that just allows me to toggle that on and off. I then have a conditional card. So this section right here only shows up if the D&D mode Boolean is toggled on. I have custom buttons built here. What each of these buttons do is when they're pressed, they change the drop-down helper to the correct setting, and also they check their state based upon what the drop-down setting is set to. So it'll turn yellow when things are, like if intermission is the scene and it is bright will be yellow, intermission will be yellow. And if I click something else, it will change the drop-down, and then also it will light up and the other one will darken. I also have volume buttons here, and I'll go ahead and pull up the codes for these. So here's the one for turning down the volume. And this uses the Alexa Media Player integration from Hacks. And it basically, when you push this button, it calls a service. And the service it calls is Play Media to the Living Room Echo, and just sends a command to turn the volume down in custom. So what that basically, it's the same thing as if I told the Echo this right here, and the Echo will react as if I had just spoken that with the command word for the Echo. The other buttons in here, so redo music, redo lights. I sometimes, especially with the Echo integration with other services, so going out of Home Assistant into the Echo into Spotify or something like that, I sometimes have it hang. So each of these buttons basically allow me to call the automation. This one calls the automation that cues the music and just manually calls it and has it run through the automation again. And the same thing with the lights. And then I also have an entity pulling from my Echo in the living room that is just pulling the current volume, so I can see that there. It's expressed as a decimal form. This is one of those things that I'd like to improve on, but I haven't yet found. I'd like to take this and just multiply it by 10. That way when it's 0.5, it just displays as 5. Or even if I could get it to be like 50% or something like that. But I haven't yet figured out how to get it to do that. So now diving into the automations, I have 4 automations that control everything. I have a master switch on, a master switch off, a light control, and a music control. So we're going to start with the master switch on. This runs when that D&D mode switch is turned on and basically prepares everything for the other lighting and music controls to run. So once again, we're using the Alexa Media Player to run a custom command, and this command is connect to my speaker. I have a Bluetooth capable soundbar in my living room that I have associated with the Echo in the living room. So when it runs this, it will connect to that Bluetooth speaker. I then have it delay for 20 seconds because it sometimes takes a while for the Echo to connect to the speaker. And if I try and get the Echo to do anything else while it's trying to connect to the speaker, this can cause hangs. So I just put a delay in there. Once again, another improvement point is I tried building a wait in here, and for it to look at the Echo and wait for it to be connected to the Bluetooth speaker, but I just couldn't seem to get that to work, so I went the brute force method of just putting a delay in there that's long enough for me to be almost guaranteed that it, by the time this delay is over, it should be connected to the speaker. I then turn off the normal light switch. This is just another helper Boolean that I have in my overall automations that when it turns on, it resets all the lights to sort of the default values that they're supposed to be in the house. So this just makes sure that that gets turned off because it needs to be turned on later when we exit D&D mode. Once again, another delay just to make sure everything's where it needs to be before we start calling some more advanced stuff. Then we do a basic setup to get things rolling. So after all of our setup is done, we'll go ahead and take our D&D scene and set it to intermission. This is sort of the bright lights, general music playing that's sort of a build up start. Not music that I use for any specific scenes, but just to sort of get you ready to play the game is built into the scene. And then by default, just to make sure once again things are set up, the intermission scene doesn't have a bright or a dark mode. It's just itself. But I want all my other automations sort of rely on the drop down being on bright or dark. So by default, I just set it to bright. That way it has a default value. Now we're going to go into the lighting control, and I'm actually going to show this in a trace before I delve into the code, because there's a lot of condition or choice branches in this. So I'm going to use the trace here to sort of talk over the flow of the logic, and then I'm going to delve into 2 of the runs to give you an overview of how the code works. So first, the 2 triggers that can cause this to run automatically is either if the D&D scene drop-down changes or the D&D dark bright drop-down changes. Also, if you remember from the interface page, there's also a button that bypasses this and then just automatically starts to run all the automations in this. We'll also go ahead and after we get the trigger, we have that master switch safety in there. So it's going to check and see if D&D mode is on. D&D mode is not on. Something probably triggered this by mistake, and so I don't want any of this to run. I don't want to be sitting and eating dinner with friends and then all of a sudden the lights change and the music starts kicking on. So this is just sort of a safety switch here. It then has multiple choices that it goes down. The first thing that it's looking at is what is the scene that has been selected. And it will run through, and there's a choice for each of the scenes except for off. Then for more of the complex scenes that have a dark and a bright mode, it then has a second layer of choice where it will look, is it dark or is it bright? If it doesn't have a dark bright mode, then it just runs into the queuing of the lights. Now there's some very simple queuing of the lights. So in here, like for Tavern, I am just choosing all of the lights in my living room and setting them to what I want them to be. Or in this is a little bit more complex of one. I have different lights turning to different colors, so it calls each of them as a separate service. I then have some more advanced, and this is partly why we're looking at it here, because when I go in to edit this now, it doesn't let me use the GUI because of some of the custom coding in here. So one of the things that I really wanted to be able to do was have flickering lights to simulate torches or candlelight or stuff like that in the darker scenes. So in this case, this is my dungeon/cave lighting setup. So most of the lights will go and turn to sort of a ambient darkness color. But then I'll go and set, in this case, it's my 2 kitchen lights, which are 2 lights that are in right above the table that I play D&D in. I'll set them, I just found this color through experimenting, but I'll go ahead and set their color. And then I go into a loop. And this loop will last until the, in this case, we're only using a scene. We don't have a dark or a bright, but it will last until the scene is no longer dungeon/cave. For the more complex lighting scenes that have a dark and a light choice, I'll just jump into that loop there. It has 2 conditions, and it's an or. So repeat until either the scene is no longer the scene that we called, or dark bright is no longer dark. And then what happens in this loop, and Home Assistant community is awesome because this, I just did some searching on the forums and found someone who had done something similar and was able to take their code and then modify it. So for each of the lights that I am wanting to control, and I do these individually because I don't want them to be flickering in unison. I want each one sort of acting independently from the others. So for each of the lights, I set a transition, and then we randomly select the brightness that it will change to from a value of 15 to 70, and that's just what I found works for me. And we'll do the same for the other light. And then we'll delay from anywhere from 100 milliseconds to 500 milliseconds before we begin the loop again. So that way there's no rhythm to it also. The brightness and how long they stay at that brightness are all randomized in this, and it leads to a really nice looking effect. So that's how all of the lighting control goes. So first we have our triggers, we have the safety switch, we then figure out what scene we need to go to. If that scene has a bright and a dark mode, do we need to cue the bright or the dark mode? And then we cue all the lights to the correct setting and enter into any loops that we need to for the flickering of the lights. Now, when I first built this, I also had the system cue the music along with the lights. And this caused some issues because if I change from a dark to a bright scene, even though the playlist doesn't change, it would re-cue the playlist. And every time I cue a playlist, I introduce a chance that the echo will hang. So I split this out. This also allowed me to build those buttons that manually cue the lights or manually cue the music if something hangs. So in here, this is a pretty simple automation. It just looks and sees if the scene changes, because the scene is what drives the music. I don't have different playlists for a farm scene that's dark versus a farm scene that's light. And then we have that same safety switch that just checks and sees if our DMD mode is on. Just that way, if something gets triggered accidentally and I'm not in D&D mode, it doesn't randomly start playing music. Then we just have a whole bunch of choices that it will run through. And we have a choice for every single scene that I have built, so every single playlist that I have. So we'll check and see what scene is it in. It will then send a command to the Echo to shuffle the appropriate playlist, and I use Spotify for my playlist. And it's just a whole chain of checking and seeing and calling the correct command to shuffle the correct playlist. And that will cue the music. The final automation is what happens when I turn the master switch off for D&D mode. Basically going back to normal state in my living room. So it's just going to look and see if D&D mode gets turned off. First, it's going to pause the music playing out of the Echo. And once again, I have a delay just to prevent stacking commands on the Echo. It will then have the Echo run the command of disconnect from my speaker. And once again, this is just as if I had said the command word for my Echo and then said this to my speaker. It then will take the D&D scene dropdown and the D&D dark bright dropdown and set them both to the off state. Just once again, this is another layer of sort of safety because there are no music or lights that are associated with the off states. So for some reason, those automation get called, even though D&D mode's off. If somehow that got bypassed, none of this matches anything that should trigger anything. We'll then wait a little bit. And then, and the reason why we have the pause here is because of that flickering loop. So also setting these to off will, if I had a scene that had flickering torchlight, well, now dark has changed, or dark bright has changed away from dark, and scene is no longer the scene that's associated with it. So that will cause the loop to exit. And I just want to give a little bit of time for that loop to exit before I call the next one, which is the normal lights setting, which just uses the toggle lights service. So if lights were off, they'll be off at the end of it. It calls the toggle light service twice. And each time it does that, it sets all the lights back to their normal state. And then it will turn. So this turns on the normal light switch, which causes that automation to run, which at the end of that automation, it turns the normal light switch back off and is basically ready to be triggered again. The reason why I do it through a Boolean is that way I can have this exposed to Alexa as a switch. So if I ever want to build a voice command around setting the lights back to normal, I can easily do that. And that is all of the automations that enable me to run my D&D scenes. And like I said, hopefully it helps you build something that either is similar or the same thing. And like I said, this is my very first big project in Home Assistant. So I'm sure there's some places where I could have improvements, more efficient operation. But I like it, and it's a lot of fun to show off to friends.